Here's a powerful, dramatic, and informative YouTube article on the Pontiac GTO Evolution A second generation, 1976, without mentioning handling conditions. Pontiac GTO Evolution at the final roar of the second generation, 1976. By 1976, the American muscle car wasn't dead a broken bar but it was wounded. Gasoline was expensive, insurance was brutal, emissions regulations had choked the power out of once mighty engines, and the streets that once echoed with the thunder of V8s were now filled with silence. But Pontiac wasn't done. In a final act of defiance and dying roar before the curtains closed, they gave the GTO one last run in 1976. Not as the legend it once was a broken bar but as a reminder of what once ruled the asphalt. This is the untold story of the 1976 Pontiac GTO as the last of the second generation, a symbol of rebellion, a machine born in a fading era, broken bar, the final muscle car cry before the storm of change. Chapter 1. The GTO legacy was no accident. The Pontiac GTO exploded onto the scene in 1964. It was raw, fast, loud, and it didn't ask for permission. By the late '60s, the GTO had become the poster child of American performance. It stood tall beside Chevys, Chargers, Mustangs, and Road Runners. It defined an entire generation. But muscle cars weren't made for subtlety. And in the early 1970s, that started to catch up with them. Chapter 2. The second generation begins. In 1968, the GTO underwent a radical transformation. Gone were the boxy lines of the early years. In came curvier, more aggressive styling, hidden headlights, Coke bottle bodies, shaker hoods. It was still the king of the street, but behind the scenes, change was coming. By 1971, horsepower ratings were dropping, not because engines were getting weaker, but because the government required manufacturers to measure power differently, in net horsepower, not gross. And in 1973, the GTO moved from its muscular A-body roots to the larger, heavier Colonnade A-body platform. It was still called a GTO, but something had changed. Buyers could feel it. Chapter 3, 1974. As the GTO gets smaller. In a bold and controversial move, Pontiac downsized the GTO in 1974. No longer based on the Le Mans, the GTO now became an option on the Pontiac Ventura, a compact platform similar to the Chevrolet Nova. For some, it was a betrayal. For others, it was a last attempt to keep the GTO name alive during a dark time for performance. The 1974 GTO came with a 350 cubic inch V8 making 200 horsepower. It had rally wheels, sport stripes, and a hood coupe, but it wasn't enough to ignite the fire. Sales dropped dramatically. The writing was on the wall, a broken bar. Chapter 4, 1975. At the disappearance, the GTO vanished from the lineup in 1975. Pontiac didn't even issue a version that year. The name disappeared quietly, without fanfare. To the muscle car faithful, it was a funeral with no mourners. The streets were quieter. The legend was fading, but it wasn't gone. Not yet. Chapter 5, 1976. One final flame. Then came 1976. America had just turned 200. Disco was on the rise. The Trans Am was stealing the spotlight. And Pontiac came, maybe out of nostalgia, maybe out of stubborn pride, brought back the GTO one last time. This was the final year of the original GTO era, a second-generation swan song. But this GTO, a broken bar, was different again. Chapter 6. The Ventura returns, one last ride. The 1976 Pontiac GTO was again based on the Ventura, a compact body with clean lines and subtle aggression, but Pontiac gave it more style than before. It came standard with a bold chrome grille with quad headlamps, a unique GTO hood with dual scoops, body-colored sport mirrors, rally wheels, and available striping packages that whispered rather than shouted. This was no longer the loud-mouthed brawler of the '60s. This was a street fighter in a tailored suit, quiet, but deadly. Under the hood, things got interesting. A broken bar. Chapter 7. The 400 V8 muscle's last stand. The 1976 GTO came standard with a Pontiac 400 cubic inch V8, making 180 horsepower and 325 pounds-feet of torque. That might sound modest compared to the 389s and 455s of old, but in 1976, those numbers were revolutionary. Other muscle cars were gone. Ford had neutered the Mustang into a Pinto-based shell. Chevy had pushed the Camaro into Malaise-era mediocrity. But the GTO, it still packed a genuine V8, still had a dual exhaust system, still offered a 4-speed manual transmission with a Hurst shifter. For the true believers, a broken bar that mattered. Chapter 8. A rarity in disguise. The 1976 GTO didn't sell in massive numbers. Only 13,800 units were produced. But that rarity has only made it more special today. Why? Because it marked the end of an era. The last GTO to be sold as a standalone package before the name vanished for decades. The final Pontiac GTO made during the original muscle car wave. A sleeper car forgotten by many, but loved by the faithful. This was the last breath of the GTO legacy before it went dark for nearly 30 years. Chapter 9. The Culture Shift. By 1976, American car culture was changing. Horsepower was no longer the headline. Safety, fuel economy, and emissions ruled the conversation. But Pontiac knew that performance still mattered, even if it had to evolve. The GTO quietly passed the torch to the Trans Am, which would carry the flame of performance through the rest of the decade. In movies like Smokey and the Bandit, the Trans Am would become the next icon. But those who remembered the GTO, a broken bar, knew it all started here. And those who saw the 1976 model knew one thing: the heart still beat. Chapter 10. Legacy in the Shadows. The 1976 GTO never got the fame of its 60s siblings. It didn't have a Judge variant. It wasn't in the spotlight, but it was necessary. It was the last page in a book that had defined American performance. It held the line when the others had fallen. It carried the badge when others abandoned it. It proved that even in a weakened state, the GTO still meant something. And today, collectors and enthusiasts are rediscovering this underappreciated beast, not as a failure but as the final warrior of the muscle car war. Final chapter. The GTO spirit never dies. The Pontiac GTO would return in 2004, redesigned, reborn in Australian skin, but it would never quite recapture the fire of its origin. Because the true GTO spirit lived between 1964 and 1976, and in that final year a broken bar's disco played. As gas prices soared, as government regulations mounted a broken bar, the GTO stood its ground. It didn't surrender, it didn't fade quietly. It gave us one last V8 roar. And for those who still remember a broken bar, the 1976 Pontiac GTO is more than just a footnote. It's a final chapter, a defiant exclamation mark at the end of the muscle car era. And it deserves to be remembered, not for what it wasn't, a broken bar, but for what it still was. Would you like a matching video thumbnail concept or an intro script with music used for your YouTube channel next?